A couple of things that I want to advise you on. First is that I will not be speaking so much about cognitive science. It will be some sort of intertwining material, but mostly on philosophical side. Same thing, I actually tricked you. It will be not really about universal sentences, it will be more about generics, but I don't really like the word generics, and therefore I will show you why I don't like that word, and probably that all makes sense at the end. So there's a just small introduction to the structure of what I speak. So basically I will argue on three things. First, that there is no essential difference between generics and universals, though there are different logical forms typical for different grammatical forms. Second, I will argue for a new theory of generics, because I do not find any existing account kind of convincing. And if we still have some time, which I actually doubt, I will show some nice results that stem from that. So basically one of those results would be that a posteriori necessity, famously introduced by Kripke in his famous paper, well, a couple of lectures naming necessity, is reducible to linguistic ambiguity behind different readings of universals. So if that all is good, we can start. Okay, so first, small introduction. Probably most of you are familiar with those terms, what are generics and what are universals. So basically universals are recognized as simple sentences that explicitly quantify over some kind and all individuals coming under that kind. So for example, and it's of course not just for kinds, it can be just for some definite description that picks up, well, some bunch of people or dogs or things and objects in general. So for example, all men are mortal. By that we just mean that each and every person is mortal. And the sentence is definitely false if there is at least one person which is not. If it is some strange coincidence in the world that all lawyers have all the insurance numbers, which is actually, I think it's not true, but it's a popular example. If at least one doesn't have that, well, the sentence is not true, and accordingly all alive people are born after 1850s. Well, it seems to be true right now, probably it was false like 100 years ago. And generics are, well, such sentences as men are mortal, dogs bark, tick scary Lyme disease. And I will soon try to kind of provide deeper intuitions behind those two terms. So basically, what is typical for universal sentences? Well, they quantify over individuals, usually using explicit quantifier, and they are true if each individual that falls under that term bears a property. And they are really unstable truths, as we see, for example, from that all alive people are born after 1850s. They are really kind of changing. And generic, well, they quantify over probably some, probably minority, majority, sometimes, as we will see, even none individuals falling under the kind. Well, they might be true even if some individuals do not bear a property, and they are relatively more stable truths. So, for example, if that sentence dogs bark, even if some strange disease strikes all dogs, and only 3 dogs survive that do not bark as a coincidence, well, it still seems to be true that dogs in general bark. Okay, so for a logical form, well, it seems that universals have this simple logical form. We say that for all x, if they fall under some concept S, then they have property P. And for generics, there is no clear way of doing that. Okay, now first I want to go for my first claim that I introduced. So I will doubt that there is real difference between universals and generics. So the question first is, are all universals actually universal? So it seems that there are some sentences such as all teenagers misbehave or it always rains in Glasgow. Well, I can attest because I, for a time now, live in Glasgow and it is really rainy there. Well, both seem to be true, even though there are teenagers that do not misbehave and there are clearly days when it does not rain in Glasgow. So they actually both look like universals. It seems like they explicitly quantify over some individuals, but they behave like generics. And well, there are some tests for genericity if we are confused whether we have universal or generic, because they are kind of confusing. Well, we have at least three tests proposed. So first is proposed by Cohen, and well, it goes under the name absolutely. Well, it seems that with universals, we can add word absolutely at the beginning of the sentence, and it just makes sense. So for example, if we have sentence all men are mortal, which is clearly universal, I can say absolutely all men are mortal. But then, well, if I have a sentence birds fly, it doesn't make sense to say absolutely birds fly. Well, against that, I have a sentence which I will soon try to kind of prove that it's just a generic in disguise. It seems that absolutely all teenagers misbehave. It's all fine with that sentence. Well, then we have another test, which is kind of on the same manner as a test called accept, which is introduced by Moltmann and Zuber. Kind of, so we can do the same thing. If we have, well, every bird is sad, we can add every bird except for Tweety is sad, and it still makes sense. But if we have generic, such as birds fly, we can't say birds except for Tweety fly. But it seems that against that, all teenagers except for Dorothy misbehave makes perfect sense. So if it is really generic in disguise, well, actually this test is also not really good. And as we see, the same thing works with even. So what you can claim is that actually, well, there is maybe some ambiguity. Maybe this is actually generic in disguise, what I have. But when we add except, even, or absolutely, maybe then we kind of inadvertently change it to universal, and we just have universal interpretation of that sentence. Well, against that, let us have two mock arguments. So first argument, let it be this. So imagine one person says, well, every teenager, even Dorothy, misbehaves. Second, person answers, but Mike does not misbehave, even though he's a teenager. And then first person can say, well, Mike must be a very special kid. And this makes complete sense. Well, against that, if we have a sentence which is clearly universal by wide agreement, such as lawyers have all the insurance numbers, presume for now that it's the case. So I have one person saying, well, every lawyer, even Jack, has all the insurance number. Another person answers, but James has even insurance number even though he's a lawyer. And then the answer, well, James must be a very special lawyer, doesn't really make sense, because it doesn't seem that it's something about him being a lawyer, right? That he has all the insurance number. It seems to be just a contingent fact. So, well, I would like to conclude from this that it really seems that even when we add this even or except, we really are not changing the sentence. We still are dealing with generic rather than universal. And then, of course, if I want to say that there is no real distinction between universals and generics, I have to have converse thing, so some generics must be universal. So let us have lawyers have odd national insurance numbers. Well, it seems to be a false sentence, because lawyers just do not have it as a rule. But then imagine that such strange phenomena happened in only one city of Czech Republic, say, I'm sorry if I say it incorrectly, because it's extremely hard with this strange R, Předov. Well, then lawyers in Předov have odd national insurance numbers that actually can be a true sentence, even if some lawyers in Předov do not have national insurance numbers. So actually we can have generic interpretation, or we as well can have universal interpretation. It seems to be true that, well, if it's even a coincidence, in Old Czech it's not true that lawyers have odd national insurance numbers. It's true only in Předov. We can actually say, well, lawyers in Předov have odd national insurance numbers. It seems to be correct universal sentence, because it doesn't deal with property of being lawyer and connecting it with having a number. It just seems to be case. So also I think this is the case, thanks to my colleague Vidus from Vilnius University. Well, people do not know whether God exists. It seems that this sentence is generic because it doesn't explicitly quantify over individuals, but it seems that it's trying to tell only one thing, that each and every person does not know that God exists. If we find only one person that knows that God exists, we are no longer plausible to say that people do not know whether God exists. So it actually seemed that, well, some generics are actually universals in disguise, and that we can also have two readings of them. So, okay, what I want to note is that actually, well, it makes sense then not to speak about universals and generics, but speak about generic and universal use. And what I think it's pretty plausible is that we can invoke well-known distinction between the dicto and the re, and kind of notice that when we are dealing with generic interpretations, we are basically dealing with the dicto, and when we are dealing with universal interpretations, we are basically dealing with the re. So take all teenagers misbehave. Well, if we want to say that being a teenager is associated with misbehaving, which is the dicto reading, it follows from someone being teenager, well, it seems to be true. But if we have the re reading, all teenagers, well, whatever that actually falls, as a matter of fact, under all teenagers, they misbehave. Well, of course, this doesn't seem to be true, because I at least assume that they are teenagers, they do not misbehave. And Well, another example, I probably just saved time, so I'll skip to the next slide. Okay, so conclusions on my first point. Well, it seems that some universals behave like generics and some generics behave like universals. But then that is even supported from arguments from experimental philosophy and cognitive science. This is probably my only glimpse of what is happening there. Well, preschool children tend to interpret universally quantified sentences as generics. And another thing, well, adults actually tend to prefer generic interpretations when it is available, even when they're dealing with universals. Famous example being ducks lay eggs. Well, in fact, this is not true as a universal sentence because only female ducks lay eggs. But well, people tend to say that the sentence is actually true, so they interpret it as a generic, while it is, well, pretty much explicitly universal. So conclusion first for my first statement is that there is no actually essential difference between those two. Well, but there is something happening there with two different readings, and probably we should speak about those readings. Okay, so the next section is a little bit more ambitious, and I'm not sure whether I have time enough for that, so I'll probably mostly just do a sketch. So please, could you, I do not have a clock. 50 minutes, yeah, 50 minutes, cool. Okay, so well, there are two questions that theory of generics must answer. So first is, what is a truth condition for generic use, if there is such? And what is a logical form of generic use? Second, practically stemming from the first, if of course there is one unique logical form for them. Why these are hard to answer questions? Well, first, it seems that for generics, not like for universals, it's really hard to tell what are the truth conditions, because we have sentences that seems to be essential and true for all individuals. For example, water is H2O. Well, all instances of water are H2O, this essential factor. It couldn't fail. Or, well, shoemakers make shoes. Then there seems to be, well, sentences that quantify only over majority. For example, dogs bark. It seems that only majority of dogs bark, and this is enough to make the sentence true. But then we have even more special sentences, such as ticks carry Lyme disease, which are true even though only minority of ticks carry Lyme disease. And then even more strikingly, we even have sentences that are just false, kind of, because no individual satisfies the condition, but well, they are in fact true. So take SCTI, agency in US that deals with alien signals, and it is true that SCTI registers alien signals, even though they never registered even a single one. Okay, so now it seems to be really, really hard because it seems that it's not about quantification over individuals. Even more, these are those sentences like people are autistic. Well, there are people that are autistic, but sentence people are autistic seems to be false. So it seems that it is really hard to tell one condition why they all are true, of those that are true, and of course, of those that are false, why they're false. Okay, so I'll quickly skim through existing accounts on generics. So first one, this is closest to what actually I will try to say, is simple kind predication, introduced by Carlson in his 77 PhD thesis, and later developed by Liebesman. So basically they say that, well, kind words, those words like dog or horse or whatever, they just refer directly to kinds instead of individuals. And well, generics predicate properties directly to kinds. But then there are problems, such as, for example, cats lick themselves. It seems that if we speak about cats as a kind, it is not really easy then, if we try to have any logical formalization, to get to each single cat, right? Because we do not have just a sentence, cat licks cats. We have cats lick themselves, so we kind of have to speak about individuals. And then, of course, famous donkey sentences, such as donkey owners beat their donkeys. It is analogously really hard. And well, simple kind predication is not really adequate answer to that. Well, the second pretty popular account was one of normality, which actually faces its own problems. So basically, these are claims that, well, if we say dogs bark, or people have two legs or something, we just mean that normal individuals do that. But what are the problems? First, well, it seems that it is not really clear what do we mean by normal. Is it something not normal about penguin not flying? It doesn't seem so. It seems like, well, penguin is a perfectly normal bird, really well adapted to his natural environment by laws of evolution. Everything is fine with him. But then, well, these accounts would say it's not normal. And then second, if we really try not just to focus on normal individuals, but on some assumptions, normal worlds, it is not clear how to identify those normal worlds. And then finally, there are problems with fictional generics. For example, unicorns have one horn. It seems to be true, and it seems that it's false that unicorns have two horns, but well, it doesn't seem that we have any normal unicorns in the world, or even in some possible worlds. And then we have psychological theories. Prominent defender of them is Leslie, which actually wrote a lot on that subject and even did some empirical investigations on that. Well, they usually just deny existence of uniform logical form or truth criteria. They're basically just trying to introduce some pragmatic or, well, context-sensitive, those are named 4 and 5 here, approaches trying to, well, say that it's really about just communication and roles, how they work. Okay, I will not really focus on 4 and 5 because, well, what you want to do actually want to arrive at some logical form and for universal truth criteria. So if I do that, well, 3, 4, and 5 is really just irrelevant to me. Okay, so first, what they want to do is really to notice that it's not just a problem of generics. It's analogous problem for singulars as well. From our logic lectures, well, we all know that singulars are probably if anything is easy in logic, well, singulars are easy. And it seems that they are, in fact, not easy at all. So if we have such sentence as John is a man, well, it seems he always is one. But then if we have sentence John is fun, well, we don't need John always be fun. Mostly, probably, but sometimes he might be in a bad mood. And then, well, if we have sentence like John makes shoes, well, he probably just does that for a couple of hours every day. He doesn't need to do that majority of time. And then if we have famous example, Mary sorts the mail from Antarctica, well, even though probably no mail was ever written, that can be the case. And if it's just her job, it still seems to be true. So we have all the same variety of sentences here. So then we can ask, is there any universal truth condition for singulars? Probably there's the same problem, or at least it seems to mimic the problem of generics. And then what we try to suppose is that actually we can have this truth condition by doing a slight trick. If you remember the famous article by Quine on what there is, he does the trick with such things as proper names as Pegasus or Aristotle. He tries to rewrite them in a property way. So I kind of do converse way. So when I have such sentence as John is fun, I can say, well, John is a fun doer. He is always fun doer, even though he does not need for that to always do fun. Well, when I say John makes shoes, instead of that I can say John is a shoemaker. So even when he's a shoemaker, he's always a shoemaker, but though he can make shoes just for a couple of hours a day. And if Mary sorts the mail from Antarctica, even though she never does that, well, I can plausibly say Mary is a mail from Antarctica sorter, which is a stable property and which is always true of Mary. Okay, so you can well, now guess what I will do with generics as well, probably. Well, it will be a little bit more complicated, but okay, probably, yeah, just to notice that actually what introduce the amount of time or amount of like uniformity that one or another property has to bear, well, it's introduced by properties themselves, which is really nice thing. I do not have to worry about them anymore. So I have property shoemaker. It is that property that assigns only some time of, well, John's life when he makes boots. Okay, well, from what you heard about concepts, I think it seemed that it's pretty plausible that generics are actually statements about concepts, right? Especially from those fictional character statements, such as unicorns have one horn. So, well, if we have sentence ticks carry Lyme disease, it seems to be somehow about being a tick rather than being an individual who happens to be a tick. And unicorns have one horn versus unicorns have two horns. Well, it cannot be about any particular unicorn because they are none. So it seems to really do something with concepts. Okay, so for that, if I want to claim that, I really want to introduce one thing. Well, typically people are kind of skeptical when they speak about knowledge about concepts. It is all good and cool if we speak about knowledge of individuals, but then these are some assumptions that concepts they have some intrinsic meaning explanations, but you cannot really know something about concept. So in the individual case, well, we have such sentence as the highest mountain on earth is a mountain. It seems to be true about kind of, well, way of referring to individual. But when we have Aristotle was born in Stagira, it's like genuine knowledge about individual Aristotle. But we have the same thing with concept as well. Well, dogs are mammals, or famous example, bachelors are unmarried men. It seems just to be explanation of meaning, but well, dogs wear collars. It seems to be genuine knowledge about some empirical observation, and still to be knowledge about concept. Okay, so what I try to do is to say, well, okay, if they are actually statements about concept, then we must use second order logic to give a plausible account of them. So, well, for that, I will probably skip the Phrygian thing. It should probably make some things more clear, but just focus on the second part. So here, what we have here. What I want to say is that, well, we have two types of logical operators or things happening. What I want to say that usually when we have generics, we have some strange consequential implicative relation which just says that, well, x gives rise to y, which is linear operator. Well, it happens on the same level. It is not claim about a concept, like it's not a property of concept, but it's a property that concept kind of implies or is related to. And then we have sentences that are actually proper second order logic sentences as y is predicated on x. So examples are dogs wear collars. It seems that this sentence is just kind of dogs have this connection to wearing collars. But then when I say, for example, dogs exist, there's a famous case noticed by Frege that we actually predicate existence as a second order concept on dogs. And when we say dodos are extinct, this is basically the same thing. We just say about dodos as a concept that it does not instantiate. And natural numbers are well ordered is another example when we are dealing with proper second order predication. So about that property, probably something more in the next slide, I guess. Oh, okay, yes. Well, there's a fun part. I really wanted to spend more time on that. I just don't have time. And it's very sad. If my theory is actually correct, if this is really what is happening, well, what it predicts? It predicts that we should have all combinations. Well, we have all singulars there. I mean, like, it's singular sentence about something that holds for all individuals. This is about that holds for majority. This is for minority, and this is for none. This is kind sentences. So kind, well, all individuals of that kind must have that property. Majority of individuals must have that property, minority, and then none. So, well, for example, A1 would stand for majority of individuals should always have that property. So which birch is a tree. Probably the most fun example is that none individuals never have some property, and it still can be a true sentence. So this is D4. It's based on some small assumption. I'm not really sure that it happens, but it at least could happen. So sentence, Christians think that the ancestor of my dog was created in one day. Well, I believe that today's Christians do not really take literally that world was created in 7 days. I think they see it as a metaphor. But still it is right to say that Christians believe that world was created in 7 days. So if that's the true, I can really plausibly claim that Christians think that the ancestor of my dog was created in 1 day. Well, no Christians actually believe this doctrine straightforwardly, and none of them actually think about my dog. So therefore, non-Christians never think about that, but well, it's still true to say that. Another example, probably less striking and more acceptable, is the one, well, Randy Prize winners have superpowers. There is a special prize for those that have superpowers if they can prove that. So any Randy Prize winner would have superpower, well, but as a matter of fact, there are none. And the sentence still is true, Randy Prize winners have superpowers. So actually we have all combinations here, and if you're interested, we can speak about that later, and I will just put that slide at the end of my talk, which is pretty close, I guess. So, yes, so then the last point, then it's about truth condition. So truth condition that I propose is that, well, if my theory is true, if that is really some relation of concept to property, then predicated property must be causally related to a concept, and that should be enough. And that should just give an account of the theory. So if we want to test that, if we want to test whether some generic is true, question to ask is, by virtue of what is it true that X is Y? And suggested answer to that should be, well, just by virtue of being X. So it's really simple with like dogs bark. Well, any individual dog is expected to bark not because X, Y, Z, but just because it is a dog. And ticks carry Lyme disease. Well, any individual tick is expected to carry Lyme disease not because some weird scientific trick happened, but just because they're ticks. This is enough for them to be able to carry Lyme disease. Okay, and then there are a couple of problematic examples. So kangaroos live in Australia. It doesn't seem that it is really some sort of direct causal relation between being kangaroo and living in Australia, right? But to see why it still holds, we can take another sentence, mountain chicken live in England. Well, actually, as a matter of fact, they always lived in Dominica and Montserrat, but they were partially extinct, so majority of them were transferred to England, and then Dominica and Montserrat for a couple of years was, well, virtually free of mountain chicken. So during that time, well, now they are introduced back in Dominica and Montserrat, but still majority lives in England. Is it true to say mountain chicken live in England? It doesn't seem to me to be true. It still seems to be true that they live in Dominica and Montserrat because this is the natural inhabited. So therefore, there is this authentic causal relation, but it is changing. It should be changing because we're dealing with actual knowledge about concepts. Sadly, I didn't have more time to speak about that. And well, last sentence, humans are autistic. And this is, yes, this is my final thing. So I'll finish afterwards. So this example really made much mess in the whole debate of generics because it seems that it should be true. And actually, well, what struck me as a really interesting thing is that in my own language, in Lithuanian language, we actually can say this sentence because we have two different forms of word be in that case. So humans are autistic definitely is wrong sentence because it would say that all humans are autistic. But we have difference in Lithuanian language between žmonės yra autistai, which means like people are at this time autistic, and well, žmonės būna autistai, which means people from time to time they are autistic, which makes perfect sense. I tried today to find analog in Czech language, and well, I spoke with my friend which speaks both languages, Lithuanian and Czech. Then it said that, well, he said that in Czech language it doesn't really work. It is similar thing with bivает, probably, some word like that. It should be like happens for the majority of time. Well, I don't know, but it apparently doesn't work in that case. So, but what I want to say is, well, linguistic problem rather than logical problem. And if there are languages that can explain away this difficulty, it just shows that it is just really a matter of language. So, okay, I don't have time for nice results. So probably we have time for some questions. Thank you.
So now you can ask or comment.
I really enjoyed that, and I thought that you've made good progress, on a very challenging question. Jack Endorf is a linguist, and he mentions in his book these very curious universals and singulars, three of which are acceptable and one which is not. So this is just to test your theory. But I'll try to relate it to the issue of ambiguity, because one approach would be to say that by nature, statements in the that are truly used in language are intentionally ambiguous, and then that that's actually a resource that statements have. And so to try to say that the statement means exactly one thing would be kind of missing the whole point of statements. But so the universals are: every oak grows from an acorn, and every acorn grows into an oak. Those are considered acceptable. Right. But these I think you would call singulars, and they're just kind of flipped around. An oak grows from every acorn. That's considered acceptable. Now the question is, and I think this is true and problematic in Lithuanian and English, maybe all languages, an acorn grows into every oak. So, I'll say that again, an acorn grows into every oak.
Oh,
see, so you can say, that just doesn't process. But like if you say an oak grows from every acorn, you see, that processes. And so he says there's no clear solution, and it's a very big problem because it's showing that there's some issue with quantification and semantics, etc., that there's just a deep issue. It's not clear if semantics, if syntax would solve it. But the kind of issue that I would look for is if you believe that things are ambiguous, then you could say, when you say an oak, you're always meaning potentially two things: a particular oak or all oaks. And so when you hear an oak grows from every acorn, you realize that it's not talking about the class of oaks. That's cancelled, that's negated. So it must be, the only available option is a single oak. But when you hear an acorn grows into every oak, not only is the one option negated, but the word grows into is not compatible with a single acorn becoming quantified like that. You end up believing that, well, it must be an acorn is becoming every oak, and that's just not crazy. That's just crazy. So that there's a constraint on grow into that negates one of the possibilities. There's a constraint on that negates the other. And the explanation depends on there being an ambiguous reading by nature. So that's an example of some things to challenge, just to see what your theory would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not entirely sure whether I followed everything that you said. But well, a couple of things to mention. First is ambiguity that we're talking about. If you mean ambiguity between universals, singulars, and generics, well, yes, I'm ready to accept that there exists one, and it's actually part of what I stated. Some singulars can be interpreted as generics, some generics can be interpreted as universals, and so on and so forth. Another thing, what I didn't speak about, and probably that would answer part of your question, is that, not all apparent generics are actually generics, such as, children play outside or lions are laying on the floor. It seems that, those sentences are just about some particulars rather than a kind. So I guess in your examples, this is basically this ambiguity happening. I didn't speak about that, but it is a real thing. It is not hard to control using logical formalization. If we kind of if you recognize correctly whether they are originally singular or generics. So does that answer your worry?
I guess so. I think that it's possibly true. I mean, you've done a lot of work to kind of show that
right.
That's plausible. But I think if indeed the nature of statements is to be ambiguous, then even you can add all the logical context you want, you will actually find some critic who will be able to show that you still have the same ambiguity that you weren't expecting for. So another example of the natural ambiguity would be the word meaningful. Okay, meaningful probably in every language, it can mean something that has a meaning, but also something that is significant. Okay, so. And there's no way to, and it's like no way to, it seems like there's no way to come up with a word that would avoid that ambiguity. Because once you say it has a meaning, and it's full of meaning, but it's also significant because it has a meaning. So you can't escape from, or like Jesus said about parables. He said, why do you speak in parables? Because they could understand me, and they could not understand me, and they could be damned. Well, what he seems to be saying is that, he says, you believe, that's why I speak to you plainly. But I'm God, I don't want to take people's freedom away. And if I told them plainly, I would be taking their freedom away. So I talk to them in parables because and this is his ambiguity, they would have the freedom to not understand me, and they would have the freedom to be damned. They could. So could kind of always means two things, that the choice and then the not choice.
Yeah, thanks again. The ambiguity that I'm dealing with, I'm pretty happy with that. It's really simple ambiguity. And I feel that I have tools to tell whether we have one sentence or another. And, ambiguities in general, such as, some words that have different meanings, this is just not part of my worry. I just do not try to do any of this here. So
I guess what I'm trying to say...
Probably we can continue on the...
We can. But my point is that there are cognitive ambiguities, which are not semantic ambiguities, but they're built into the design of the mind.
Yes, definitely so, probably. Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? If not, I thank you once again.